Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Zaakir Tameez, and we're going to talk about Zaakir's recent book about Charles Sumner. But first off, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Luke. Very much appreciate you having me on the show.
If you could start with introducing yourself, including how you decided to write your recent book, which is Charles Sumner, Conscious of a Nation.
Well, I graduated from law school last year, and the question I get is why on earth did you spend your time in law school writing about a dead white man from the 19th century? It started in a class where I was reading the brief that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP filed in Brown versus Board, possibly the most famous Supreme Court decision of all time, the decision that led to the integration of American public schools. And in that brief, I stumbled on the name of Charles Sumner, who's cited more than 40 times by name. And I'm shocked by this. So I wondered, why is Sumner here? I dig deeper and I discover that more than 100 years before Brown versus Board, before the Freedom Riders, before Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Charles Sumner collaborated with a 26-year-old black attorney named Robert Morris on the first interracial legal team in American history in an attempt to integrate the schools of Boston at the Massachusetts Supreme Court. They were not successful, but the arguments that Sumner and Morris developed were then repeated by the lawyers in Brown versus Board, point by point by point by point. Sumner is well known as a politician during the Civil War era. He is not well known as a champion of multiracial democracy and of racial justice. But that's the legacy that he has left behind, and it's a legacy that I wanted to uncover and to resurface in the public conversation.
Yeah, it's always interesting finding those connections between history that's a little bit farther away and history that's a little bit closer, and even in our present day.
It's amazing what the connections are.
Absolutely. How did Sumner attack slavery once he became an abolitionist? What sort of arguments did he use? How did he frame the discussion?
Well, let's give some context of where his opposition to slavery arose from. Sumner grew up in an ethnic enclave of Boston that had a large free black community. So he had grown up around free African Americans. He grew up only a couple blocks from the African Meeting House, one of the oldest black churches in the country. A few blocks from the Prince Hall Freemason Lodge, the first Masonic lodge for African Americans. And that community in which he grew up had the African Mutual Aid Society, which was an organization of free blacks who would contribute funds to give to each other. So this is a persecuted, oppressed, marginalized community, but it's also a community that's very vibrant and it's very organized and it has a lot of civic institutions. So he's seeing black civic institutions from birth, essentially. And the reason he grew up there is because he grew up in a poor white family that really couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Now, so that's his upbringing. And when he gets involved in the abolitionist struggle, his critique of slavery falls along several lines, but I think there's two that stand out. The first is that he emphasizes slavery as a tool of sexual exploitation and domination. This is something that other abolitionists also pointed out, but he was probably the only political abolitionist who made this clear among the anti-slavery politicians who tended to be more moderate than their radical abolitionist allies. I'll tell one story related to this. In 1854, Charles Sumner assists in the purchase of an enslaved family in order to give them their freedom back home to join their fugitive father in Boston. He purchases the family in Virginia and then brings them to D.C. And there he recognizes that one of the young girls is very, very white looking. She comes off as white, and she's about 6 or 7 years old. And Sumner is very struck by this because her brother had very dark skin. And he decides to take these two young kids and to put them up for exhibition on the way back from Washington, D.C. to Boston. It's a strange thing. It's arguably quite exploitative. He did ask the father for permission, and the father said yes. But the father really wasn't in a position to say no. But what he does is that he takes them to a number of churches including one where this girl is put on a stage with 5 other white girls, and people are asked to identify which one is the slave. People come up to these girls, they pull their hair, they squinch their noses, they look at their hands, they try to figure out which one is a slave, and the consensus in the room picked out a different girl. And so Sumner is trying to show that slavery, first, that the color line is so blurry as a result of centuries of rape and exploitation, and 2, that slavery affects all of us. And in so doing, he then says to his audience, ladies and gentlemen, this is slavery. Ponder it, study it, do not look away, deal with it. And it's quite striking language, because what I just said is more or less a direct quote. Sounds like something someone would say today. But he points out repeatedly that slavery is a form of sexual exploitation. And he continues to do so in the Senate as a politician who began his term in 1851. By 1856, he delivers A Crime Against Kansas, a very explosive speech in which he accuses his pro-slavery Southern colleagues of being rapists. And he makes that known very clear. The other form of critique that's worth discussing is a political economic critique. It was common for abolitionists to describe slavery as the quote-unquote slave power. The slave power is what dominated Washington. Sumner preferred the term the slave oligarchy. He observed that only about 1.5% of the American population owned more than 2 slaves. So it is a very small, concentrated, wealthy elite that are dominating American politics and the American economy at the expense of everyone else. He was involved in the Free Soil Party, which in many respects was a party that tried to represent the poor white farmer who had to compete with large landowners who were relying on exploited labor for free, essentially. Sumner argues that the slave oligarchy controlled Washington. He said they held the keys to the presidential cabinet, observing that between George Washington, the first president, and then later until James Buchanan, the last president before Lincoln, not a single United States president and not a single member of the presidential cabinet had ever voiced an anti-slavery opinion at the time they served in office. All of them were pro-slavery. Slaveholders constituted a cabal that dominated over American life. And Sumner kept saying to voters that you need to, quote, prostrate the slave oligarchy before you can pursue any other sorts of reforms. So speaking to Whig voters who cared about developing national infrastructure, who cared about expanding the national bank, who cared about other things, or even speaking to Democratic voters who cared about social welfare programs, Sumner kept emphasizing to all of them that any kind of reform you wish to pursue in this country will not be successful until you, quote, prostrate the slave oligarchy. And it was this critique, in addition to the critique of sexual exploitation, that distinguished him from pretty much all other anti-slavery politicians.
Well, that second critique is particularly interesting in the sense of seeing the slave power as a block, if you will, within the existing political institutions, seeing how they control or have undue influence within the legislative branch, have influence within the executive, perhaps the judicial branch as well, and really saying if you want to get these other things done, you're going to have to grapple with this powerful force.
Yeah, and if I can expand on that very briefly, Sumner was in the Senate in the 1850s. His neighbor, like the guy who sat right next to him in the first year, was Andrew Pickens Butler, a senator from South Carolina and the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a slaveholder who enslaved more than 70 human beings on his plantation in Edgefield County. A protege of John Calhoun, Butler lived in a home with 3 roommates. His roommates were Robert Mason, Senator Hunter, and Senator David Rice Atchison. These three men included Atchison, who was the President Pro Tem of the United States Senate, and then Mason, Hunter, who respectively are the chairs of the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the chair of the Senate, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, and the chair of the Senate Budget Committee are all four living together, and they are all Southerners, and they're all slaveholders. And they're the guys running the country. This is in the 1850s. This is right after the deaths of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. And these are the four who basically dominated American politics at a time the Senate was probably even more powerful than the presidency and was regarded as such by the public. So slaveholders control Washington politics, and they control it in not very abstract ways, but in very literal ways. The four guys who would cook breakfast together and dinners together are also talking about how to continue to spread slavery into the American West.
You write that among abolitionists, Sumner was a constitutional zealot. And you also note that there was a tension, this is a quote from your book, there was a tension between Sumner's obedience to the Constitution and his visionary, idealistic politics. One of the great contradictions of his political career was that he defended a document that obstructed his two paramount goals, liberty and equality for Black America. So I was hoping you could talk about Sumner's relationship to the Constitution and how he worked the Constitution into his abolitionist ideals.
Abolitionists have a reputation for being anti-constitutional. Most famously, William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist from Boston, who lived very close to Sumner. On July 4th, one year, standing on stage with Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau, picked up a piece of the United States Constitution and lit it on fire. He called the Constitution, quote, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, observing that the Constitution protected slavery in the states. Constitution included the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Constitution included the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Constitution protected the international slave trade for the first 20 years. All these things pointed to a very dark picture of the American founding. And that dark picture, which is grounded in very obvious realities, is something that Charles Sumner could never get behind. He saw a different way to interpret the American founding. He had an affection for the Constitution, starting in law school as a protege of Joseph Story, very famous justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was a student of Story while Story was writing the commentaries on the Constitution, which is probably to this day the most significant treatise of constitutional law. He called this treatise a light, entertaining book. His first lecture to a Black community at the Smith School, a Black school nearby his home, was on constitutional law. And he very much had a veneration for the Constitution. This put him in tension with other abolitionists. Wendell Phillips, who was Garrison's lieutenant, was actually Sumner's classmate in law school. And Phillips and Sumner had this rich debate about the Constitution. Phillips observing everything I had mentioned about the Constitution's compromises with slavery, and Sumner responding and saying that there's no constitution in the world that is perfect, and that is the best that he knew of his kind, and that if he is a citizen, if he is a voter, if he is one who is protected by the Constitution, then he must do all he can to fight slavery within the bounds of the law. Now, all this comes to fore in the 1850s. Sumner insists on a very different way of interpreting the Constitution in a manner that he thinks is both legally accurate and also politically strategic. While other abolitionists rejected the Constitution, possibly alienating many mainstream voters, Sumner embraces the Constitution and he embraces the founding fathers. So, for example, in one speech, he is accused of defaming the founding fathers because he relentlessly attacked slaveholders. And Southerners pointed out that George Washington was a slaveholder, and how dare you insult George Washington? And Sumner responds and says that George Washington freed his slaves in his will. And so he says that Washington on earth was a slaveholder, but Washington went to heaven as an abolitionist. He went to God as an abolitionist. When it came to Jefferson, Sumner observed that Jefferson, yes, was a slaveholder, but he wrote the words, all men are created equal. And temporally, he may have been a slaveholder, but he achieved immortality as an abolitionist. These are things that he really believed. I've looked at all his private letters, and I never found any hesitation about his veneration for the Founding Fathers, publicly or privately. At the same time, these are also strategically very valuable. Slaveholders didn't know how to respond to a man who literally cloaked himself in the American flag and the American founding, and who insisted that founding ideals required the ultimate and eventual abolition of slavery. And in so embracing the American project, I think he proved to be extremely successful in this mixture of radical politics with American patriotism.
That point about the all men are created equal feeds nicely into the next question I had related to the Constitution as well. Sumner's relationship to the Declaration of Independence and what stood out to him about the Declaration of Independence, how he used those ideas. Curious about that.
The Declaration of Independence is commonly attributed to Thomas Jefferson, who spent a great deal of time insisting to everyone that the Declaration was all his idea, and who continually kept emphasizing that he's the guy who wrote it. And he is the guy who wrote it. That's not false. But there was a committee, and it included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and I think one or two other founding fathers. Jefferson, in many ways, became the guy who wrote it, yes, because he's eloquent, but also because he was the youngest member of the committee. And naturally, it falls to the youngest person to do the work. John Adams, one of the seniors on the committee, also is a co-author of the Declaration. And John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, became president of the United States and then served in Congress afterwards, was an anti-slavery politician by the end of his life. So much so that John Adams once spoke to a black audience in Philadelphia and said that the day of your redemption will come. It may come in peace, or it may come in blood. He was accused on the House floor of advocating for violence, and he was asked if he would support abolition if it required people to die. And John Quincy Adams responded and said, "Let it come. Let it come though the heavens fall. Let it come though 1,000,000 white men may die. Still I say, let it come." So here is the son of John Adams, one of the founders of America, second president of the United States, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. His son is openly calling for the death of 1,000,000 white men to guarantee the abolition of slavery. John Quincy Adams, in old age, mentors Charles Sumner. And he articulates to Sumner the theory that if there is ever a state of war in America, either through a civil war or through a mass slave rebellion, then the President of the United States can use his war powers to emancipate slaves. This is the theory behind the Emancipation Proclamation. Adams explains this theory to Sumner in the 1840s. Sumner goes on to give that theory to Lincoln decades later. Also, Adams explains to Sumner that his interpretation of the Declaration that his father helped to write is that the Declaration was essentially a promissory note. The Founding Fathers had promised to one day guarantee equality for all. They failed in their lifetimes to achieve it. And it was up to the next generation to fulfill that founding promise. And that one way to do so is to amend the Constitution to abolish slavery. So Sumner is on record in the late 1840s promoting the abolition of slavery by a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments are just as unthinkable today as they were back then. So it was quite dramatic for him to even suggest the idea of an amendment at a time in which that seemed inconceivable. But then there was a civil war, the 13th Amendment was passed. And after the war, Sumner insisted that the Constitution should now be interpreted in light of the Declaration. In other words, that the language of equality and human rights should dominate constitutional law. He said the greatest victory of the Civil War was the emancipation of the Constitution itself. And he said a great rule of interpretation was conquered at Appomattox. Appomattox being the last battle of the war, when Lee surrendered to Grant. Sumner said that under the new rule of constitutional interpretation, every clause, every line, and every word should be interpreted uniformly and thoroughly for human rights. Later, he said it should be interpreted uniformly and thoroughly under the Declaration of Independence.
Well, that idea of a promissory note is an interesting one. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. uses that term many times as well, talking about an idea, whether or not perhaps, this is at least sort of how I think about it, whether or not perhaps the people who issue that idea or put out that idea are necessarily living up to it or even capable of realizing it or even desiring to realize it, whatever you want to say about that, that it puts that idea out there and sort of says, this is what we're trying to get to. This is the promise we're sort of trying to obtain. And then, well, have we, I guess, becomes the thing people look at. I wanted to turn to post Civil War. We're at the end of 1871 now, and Sumner makes a motion from the Senate floor to add the entirety of his civil rights bill, which required the integration of all juries, schools, churches, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, and common carriers like trains and streetcars, reading out a definition there, to a proposed amnesty bill for most ex-Confederates. He wants to add that to the proposed amnesty bill. And you write that unlike many abolitionists and former radicals, Sumner was willing to extend forgiveness to ex-Confederates and let go of the deep wounds that had been cut during the Civil War, but that unlike Northern centrists and conservatives, Sumner wanted forgiveness to come alongside justice. So there's a lot to unpack there. I was hoping first you could walk us through Sumner's Civil Rights Bill, which he dies, as you note, saying, get this thing passed.
So after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, on the day that the 15th Amendment is ratified, this is the amendment guaranteeing the right of black men to vote. There's a parade in Washington, D.C. The parade reaches Charles Sumner's front yard, and the celebrants, someone goes inside and asks Sumner to come and address the crowd. This is an audience of primarily black churchgoers who are jubilant over the new right to vote. And Sumner is grumpy. He's not happy, and he tells them it's not in his nature to celebrate when there's more work to be done. And he explains to the audience that you are still shut out of the common carrier, you're still shut out of the hotel, you're shut out of the common school, you're shut out of the theater. He had been hearing from black businessmen and entrepreneurs that even though they now have their freedom and the right to vote, and they have some wealth, they're still effectively relegated to a second-class citizenship status because they cannot participate in public life on the same footing and in the same spaces as white Americans. So Sumner collaborates with John Mercer Langston, a law professor at Howard University who was African American. He asked Langston to write up a bill that was essentially a national integration bill, a bill that would have created a right of public accommodation for anyone regardless of race, and a right to sue for damages if you are discriminated against in a public space. That's the Civil Rights Bill. And if it sounds familiar, this bill was the blueprint of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I had chills when I read the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I saw that the first two sections are nearly verbatim what Sumner and Langston had written more than a century earlier. So that's the Civil Rights Bill. This is a visionary bill. And come the early 1870s, many white Northerners, including anti-slavery white Northerners, are exhausted by the cause of civil rights and kind of just want to move on, so to speak. They're also uncomfortable with the idea of free African Americans going to the same schools as their kids, being in the same churches, being on an equal footing. Even though they had championed the abolition of slavery, they are not champions of the abolition of racism. Around the same time, President Grant is considering the proposal to give amnesty to Confederate office holders, to people who previously served in public office, joined the Confederacy, committed treason against the United States. Grant wants to extend an olive branch, so to speak, to bring the country back together. More accurately, to bring the white country back together. Sumner says, okay. He offered to vote in favor of the amnesty bill in exchange for supporting the civil rights bill. And he sought to amend the amnesty bill to include the civil rights bill because the floor managers otherwise refused to consider the civil rights bill on the House and Senate floor, and I believe in committee as well. So he proposes it instead as an amendment, which allows him to take the floor. And he launches this long debate about amnesty and civil rights, which Sumner said should go hand in glove. It was a fascinating debate, in part because many radicals were extremely opposed to amnesty because they wanted to continue to punish the rebels. And yet, many of those radicals were not optimistic or excited about racial integration. And Sumner kept pointing out that this is a contradiction, that if you wish to punish the rebels, you should uplift the former slaves. And Sumner is trying to now propose forgiveness for all and the upliftment of the free people. And he attempts that for several years, in fact, and he never quite succeeds.
That's an interesting point, Sumner's point that, well, if you want to punish the ex-Confederates, one way to do that is to actually uplift a large section of the society that they were oppressing, namely their former slaves, and seeing that as part and parcel of the punishment process in a way. And it's an interesting moment, this attempt to add the Civil Rights Bill to that amnesty bill, almost as if you're getting very visibly those two currents of where Reconstruction is at the time. This strong force for forgetting or rewriting the history, the idea of peace and reconciliation, and air quotes, that brings the white country together, and then still a desire to have a more transformative outcome from this period.
It's quite remarkable. Sumner also wanted to engage in mass land redistribution. He said to, quote, shatter the plantations and give the pieces to the slaves. He envisioned an entirely upended Southern society in which freed people, in effect, became the rulers. And this is amazing. And in fact, it's not entirely, it somewhat did happen. Across the South, after the passage of the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, Southern states held new constitutional conventions open to both whites and blacks, the only condition being that no one who had participated in the rebellion was invited to join. And as a result, African Americans who had been mass enslaved just a couple years earlier are now literally writing constitutions. Many of the rights we take for granted in state constitutional law were drafted by former slaves, by Black founding fathers. For example, I grew up in Texas, and in Texas, every student has a right to an adequate education. It's in the Texas state constitution. There's been a number of cases throughout Texas history at the state Supreme Court forcing the legislature to increase funding for public schools. That right for an adequate education emerged from what formerly enslaved people in Texas wrote into the document in the late 1860s. South Carolina had a majority Black legislature in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Louisiana had a Black governor. And this is what Sumner had envisioned after the Civil War, was a new society that was effectively run by formerly enslaved people, because he believed that they had all the capacity they needed to self-govern and to run their own economies and to run their own legislatures. And that's precisely what he had hoped to accomplish with Reconstruction, a real, genuine, multiracial democracy.
A large part of the context of what's going on here in 71, but throughout the 70s and perhaps even immediately after the war ends, is that the slave question continues to loom large. Obviously, the slave question is the question. And you note that the slave question united the Republican Party before the war, but that this unity was fading by the time Sumner dies, and he dies in 1874. So I was curious how the Republican Party changes and then how these changes impact Sumner.
The Republican Party was born through the opposition of spreading slavery into the American West. The first Republican convention in 1856, this is the first RNC, passed a platform that included the absolute ban on slavery in the territories. The Republican Party is the anti-slavery party. It's the party proposing to prostrate the slave oligarchy, as Sumner had once said. In many ways, Sumner is a mascot and arguably one of the founders of the Republican Party. But after the abolition of slavery, in some ways, the Republican Party had succeeded. It was a single-issue party that had achieved victory. And once victory was achieved, the party fractured along a number of lines, because suddenly all the divisions that had always existed in the party are now apparent. It was a mix of farmers who were looking for support, who supported greenbacks, for example, as a way to pay off their debts, and industrialists who wanted a credit-run economy and who wanted government subsidies for their own businesses to continue to industrialize the nation, who wanted state monopolies for the railroad companies and the like. Then, of course, there are old guard abolitionists who believe in racial justice. And then there are Westerners in the party, including President Grant, who want to continue to expand America into the frontier, to give homesteads, and perhaps to continue the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans in order to give more land to white settlers. The Republican Party is all these things. It's a complicated party. And by the 1870s, Sumner is furious with the Republicans because he believes the soul of the Republican Party is racial justice. That's not what a lot of other people believe. All this comes to fore in 1872, when Grant has refused to endorse the Civil Rights Bill, and while Grant is pursuing an imperial project to annex the Dominican Republic. Sumner is so outraged by both of Grant's actions that he leaves the Republican Party and calls on Black America to also leave the Republican Party in order to vote for the Democratic and liberal candidate, Horace Greeley, a known media mogul huckster. He owned the New York Tribune, who continually gave different opinions about basically everything, and who was an abolitionist once upon a time and is now just screeching out racist dribble, and who even said that abolitionism was a mistake. Man of really no principles, in my view. So Sumner is endorsing Horace Greeley for president, not so much because he supports Greeley, but as a way to punish Grant. And he tells Black voters, and remember that this is the second election in history in which Black voters are participating en masse, to abandon Grant and to punish him, even though Grant is a member of their own party, because he was not true to rights. He says, never vote for any man who is not true to you. Astoundingly, in 1868, Grant probably lost the majority of white votes in America. He only won his election because of Black voters who probably voted for him upwards of 95%. This being the first election in which Blacks are participating. Then come 1872, even more Blacks are participating, and Sumner says that they need to punish Grant, even and risk it with Greeley as a way to bring the Republican Party back in line. His view is shared by Robert Morris, the Black attorney who collaborated with him in attempting to integrate American public schools, Boston public schools, in 1849. Morris, from his perspective, had spent the last 20 years advocating for racial integration, and he was exhausted that he had not yet achieved victory, and that the Republican Party was not championing integration yet, even though he had spent 20 plus years advocating for it. So Morris also says that if African Americans become a single party voting bloc, the party would always take them for granted. Now, most Black voters do not listen to Sumner. They do vote for Grant. Grant does win re-election. Grant does not champion racial integration. He does, in some ways, take their votes for granted. And yet Sumner, who had this theory, becomes very discredited because he had endorsed a racist. And Sumner becomes a pariah in Washington, D.C. He's ultimately expelled from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that he had chaired. He is extremely ineffective and unable to advocate for the things he cared about because the party had abandoned him, or he had abandoned the party, depending on how you look at it. And Frederick Douglass and others insisted that Sumner was wrong to the end for failing to endorse the Republicans in 1872, while Douglass and other Black leaders had done so. And you can see the complexities of this debate to this day. And towards the end of Sumner's life, one of the final things he does is he introduces a bill to abolish the Electoral College, to create a popular vote mechanism in which every American could vote for president. And then, the most amazing thing, to have the top three candidates for president then engage in a runoff for the top two, to see who would win, which is effectively his attempt at trying to break the two-party duopoly that had existed at the time. And here we are, more than 150 years later, still dealing with the two-party system and the complexities of that system to this day.
That's an interesting point about the Electoral College. It makes me think, or reminds me, for example, of, I believe, something that Thaddeus Stevens is wrestling with. Perhaps a lot of the radical Reconstructionists, sounds like it, are grappling with this as well, which is the structure of the American political system and how there's this strong division between different branches of government, that can influence the others. We see this a lot when Johnson, the first president after Lincoln, is putting his hands into all the efforts to bring about a deeper Reconstruction. Sumner talking about the two-party duopoly and how that's impacting his project.
Yeah, and it's amazing how we're still grappling with many of these problems and questions today.
Well, I wanted to bring us closer to the present moment for our last two questions, and also bring in a little bit more of your perspective on these things. So I wrote an article on the 4th of July for Jacobin magazine that closed with this remark, and I wanted to read it and explain how that interprets some of what I was reading about Sumner, and then get your opinion about that. So I wrote that Martin Luther King Jr. called the Declaration of Independence's universalist promise of equal rights a promissory note, as we noted, to which every American was to fall heir, and yet that promise has yet to materialize. 250 years since the Declaration was written, we still lack a constitution based on universal suffrage, equal representation, and enforceable social rights, such as affordable health care, equal pay for equal work, and self-determination for indigenous people, and that the American Revolution might have helped bring about the downfall of kings, aristocracy, serfdom, and eventually slavery, but it didn't lead to a political system in which we, the people, rule. So my argument out of that is that the Constitution that emerged from the Civil War and Reconstruction, the one that is in existence today, is also flawed because it maintains these fundamental denials of universal and equal suffrage in the Senate, federal judiciary, electoral college. There are recent examples of how those things play out. And with that perspective in mind, I found myself disagreeing with Sumner's assertion that Reconstruction's second founding, which is a term that's still used or is often used today. Eric Foner, for example, had a book, called about the second founding. And Sumner's idea that Reconstruction created an entirely new constitution, I found myself squinting my eyes as I read that, not really quite sure what to think of that. I'm curious what you think of all that.
I think on the American left, there is this temptation to denigrate and debase the value of the American project for many good reasons. The American project arguably was premised on native expropriation and ethnic cleansing. The American project comes hand in glove with slavery. The American Revolution was not as egalitarian as we wish it was. And for most of American history, racism, slavery, genocide, imperialism have been present. And yet, I think the American project is both strategically and morally important to embrace for all Americans, and particularly for progressives and people on the left. So just a couple examples from Sumner's life to highlight this. Sumner went to Europe in the 1840s. And in Europe, he was exposed to French revolutionary ideals. He was often confronted about American slavery. He had seen the possibility of blacks and whites going to school together, which is what he saw at the University of Sorbonne. In England, he is disturbed by the English aristocracy, by the rule of primogeniture, and he is also enthralled by the English radicals who called for the total upending of the British aristocracy and the creation of a real democracy. His professors back in the United States are writing to him, and one of them says, "See through all the Jacobinism, the radicalism, and the atheism, and all the other modern isms of Europe." Throughout Sumner's life, whenever he quoted from European intellectuals, he was often chastised for going to Europe for examples when America was quote-unquote good enough. During 1849, when he is trying to integrate Boston schools, he is quoting from the French Declaration of Rights. That doesn't go over very well. During the 1860s, when he is advocating for black suffrage and other matters, He's also sometimes quoting from French sources, and he's being criticized for that. Amazingly, pretty much all the scholarly literature on Charles Sumner's constitutional ideas emphasizes that he sought to implement the French vision of egalitarianism and impose it on the United States. It's an unfair critique because Sumner is also drawing significantly from American sources, and over time learns to primarily draw from American sources because he recognizes that it is much more effective that way. So, for example, Sumner is citing the Founding Fathers. He's citing the Declaration of Independence. He's insisting that the founders had a certain ideal, even if they were not able to achieve it in their lifetimes. He gives a speech where he tries to unpack what it means to be a republic. And in this speech, called The Equal Rights of All, he starts off by exploring how Plato understood a republic, how Aristotle understood a republic, how many European intellectuals understood a republic. Then he gets to Montesquieu, and to John Locke, and to John Stuart Mill. And then he says, to throw it all to the side, that all these European ideas of republic are contradictory. And he says, in vain do you look to Europe to find the meaning of republic, and instead we should look at American institutions. And then he looks at the founders who did, in fact, even though, for example, suffrage was often restricted to property-holding men, the ratification of the Constitution in the states included all voting men, property holders or not. And he points to this as an example. He points to the fact that there were African American men who voted and participated in some of the constitutional conventions. He observes that the American Revolution and the American founding was much more egalitarian than often we give credit for today and even back then. And he tries to use that to define a republic as premised on two principles: the consent of the governed and the equality of rights. Now, in so doing, I think he's more effective. In the words of Ebenezer Hoare, the first Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Sumner had drunk deep from the wells of American institutions from the Revolutionary Fathers. And in so doing, I think he was more effective. We still see this debate ongoing. Eric Foner, who you mentioned, in 2016, wrote an open letter to Bernie Sanders, where he criticized Bernie Sanders for constantly using the examples of European social democracy. Not so much because those were inapt examples, but because he believed they were ineffective examples. Because American voters, ordinary American voters, are not looking to turn America into Norway. And Foner tells Bernie Sanders in this letter, why not quote from Eugene Debs? Why not draw from this rich socialist tradition within America that Foner believed exists, that in fact does exist? And that's for, that's for a socialist project, whatever the American project is, whatever political persuasions we are. By drawing from American institutions, I think we can be more effective in that matter. And the last thing I'll say is that in recent years, Americans on left and right have been debating the real origin point of the American story. The New York Times famously launched the 1619 Project, observing that the first enslaved people arrived in one of the 13 colonies in Jamestown in 1619. And the main author, Nicole Hannah-Jones, said that slavery is in the DNA of America and racism is in the DNA of America. The problem with that analogy is that if racism is in America's DNA, there is no hope. There's no ability to change your DNA. If it is inherent, it cannot be excised. And if it cannot be excised, then it could be that the progressive critique leads to immobilizing us, making us filled with despair, and making us want to move to Europe or something like that. In contrast, conservatives say President Trump, in his first term, famously created the 1776 Commission, trying to whitewash American history and insist that the founders were virtuous and that the founding really had no problems at all. And that, yes, there was slavery, but slavery was ultimately abolished, and that the founders had kind of set the path towards the abolition of slavery. That has many of its own problems. And of course, many are uncomfortable with how much we learn about Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe, and how much we venerate these individuals, all of whom are slaveholders, many of whom were rapists. What about the project of 1865? The project of Lincoln, Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and others, who genuinely sought to create a multiracial democracy, who ever so briefly succeeded, who upended the constitutional norms at the time. Were they fully successful? No. As you point out, they were not. But I think it's a project that we can get behind, and that if we are to trace the American story, we may be better off tracing it from the 1860s, and that we are most persuasive when we can embrace the American project as opposed to rejecting it. And if we are uncomfortable with embracing the project of 76, then we should consider embracing the project of Reconstruction.
To follow up on that and to bring us to a close, I first learned about your work and your book reading an interview that you did in the New York Times with Jamel Bowie, a columnist. And it was published under the title The Civil War That Never Ended, which I think is a very provocative title. And so I wanted to close by asking you about this statement, the Civil War That Never Ended. There are many folks. We talked recently, just to plug a recent interview with Stephen Pimpare. Many other folks, he's not alone, the modern day Poor People's Campaign, they talk about the need for a third Reconstruction. I think following on this idea, perhaps, of the Civil War that never ended. So I wanted to ask you about these ideas. Do we need a third Reconstruction? How do you see that demand in all of this?
So in 1873, Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, who said that slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederate movement, who was a slaveholder himself, who had led a treasonous insurrection that killed more than 700,000 Americans, is granted amnesty, runs for office, and wins a seat in the House of Representatives representing his district in Georgia. When Stephens comes to Washington, D.C., he tells people that he is morally reformed, that he now recognizes that slavery was bad, and that now he knows better. And then, at a party, he tells General Tecumseh Sherman that he is going to support civil rights even more than Charles Sumner. We can be very skeptical of this, but interestingly, Frederick Douglass thought, what the hell, maybe. And he goes and he visits Alexander Stephens at his home. And Stephens tells him that he is considering to support Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Bill. So Douglass encourages him to do so, and a few days later, Stephens gives a speech on the House floor where he says that he agrees with the moral impulse behind Sumner's Civil Rights Bill, that now he supports racial integration. The only issue, Stephens says, is that the bill violates the time-old principle of constitutional law, state rights. This is a very cynical game. There is no way in hell that Alexander Stephens, a slaveholder who led an insurrection killing 700,000 people to uphold white supremacy, is now suddenly morally reformed and wants blacks and whites to live together and go to school together. He doesn't. But he doesn't say that. Instead, he says that now he supports it, but it's not possible because of constitutional objections. And he basically says that instead, civil rights reform must take place at the state level in the South instead of on the national level in Congress. Many Republicans despise Alexander Stephens, but they see the convenient value of his rationale and begin to cite that same rationale themselves. that the bill is morally correct, but legally incorrect, due to the time-old principle of American law state rights. Ultimately, the bill does pass in 75. The Supreme Court overturns it in 83, citing state rights. And to this day, state rights continues to be the dominant form of constitutional law. To this day, we teach in school and in law school, and it is accepted in the courts, that America has a federalist system, a system of federalism in which states and the nation are both sovereign. Sumner wouldn't even use the word federal to refer to America. He never said the term federal government. And if he did, he would actually go back to his speeches and correct it later. He continually would say national government, because he believed in this idea known as constitutional nationalism, where the national government reigns supreme. And he thought this was especially important because the national government should advance the project of equality and freedom for all. He said that there should be no state rights against human rights. He believed that Congress should be able to legislate freely in favor of human rights, regardless of what states did, and also regardless of what the Supreme Court did. He said, quote, "The Supreme Court is not arbiter of the acts of Congress." He traced this nationalism all the way back to the founding, to Hamilton, to John Marshall. And he also traced this to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which included an enforcement clause that authorized Congress to pass appropriate legislation to fulfill these amendments. So to Sumner, it was really important to reform and reconstruct American constitutional law so that the national government could advance the project of human rights without interference from states and the courts. We have never had that kind of regime in this country. And if we are to ever have a third Reconstruction, I think that is where it needs to begin.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us and introducing us to Charles Sumner. And I'm also just thinking about what you said in the very beginning about how you became interested in Sumner and these ideas, looking back, over 100 years ago at this point, and seeing parallels to what people were struggling for during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, seeing the same language being used in bills that are being put forward. And so I really appreciate you bringing out that, what I see as a long thread that's continuing the struggle for, in my opinion, a democratic country, these ideas of universal and equal rights, and bringing out the history of that and the people who were trying to do that throughout the 19th century. I think that's why your work is really important.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you for having me on and giving me an opportunity to share more about Charles Sumner.